All right, thank you. All right, welcome everyone. We're still gathering, so folks will still be joining. Alice and I have asked you here today for a very special session on DEI and trust-based philanthropy, as well as we'll be reviewing the site visit best practices. Now, there are varying levels of experience on the call here. We'll be calling on a few very experienced members to lend their perspective, but we just wanted to cover a few ground rules about DEI, trust-based philanthropy, and fundamental concepts. So it's hard to believe that things have progressed so quickly from our initial grant application request. The request for funding started way back in November, and we are up to the point of financial reviews have been concluding, and will be commencing, all the FACs will be meeting, commencing to discuss those organizations for site visits. So we're heading to our June 5th annual meeting. Everyone's very excited. There's been a lot of hard work, and we so appreciate all the time and dedication, the training team, and all of you who've lent your expertise to this process. So we wanted to kind of open the conversation about DEI, unconscious bias. What does that really mean? How does this fit into our impact world? How does this affect what you do on your FAC? So first, with the definition of unconscious bias, or implicit bias as it's sometimes called, it's just attitudes that we hold about different groups of people that can influence our actions. So it can affect the decision of your team and how, depending on how you communicate those things, and how your team reaches a decision. So sometimes we may not even be aware of those things. So it's very important to check yourself, check your list of assumptions as you move through the RFF process, working with your teams. So in evaluating the request for funding, there's some questions here that we've posed. Some of you have perhaps seen this particular slide before, because it's been in other training materials. So again, this was just meant to have an informal discussion, a review of some of the impact materials around DEI. And as you're examining the organizations, perhaps preparing for a site visit, you're asking, how did the board and staff of the organization reflect the population that they serve? Or how have did you pay attention to how the RFF is written and its content? How did you, what details leapt off the page for you? Your personal preferences and biases, how they affect the worthiness of an organization, your ranking, and the comments that you've put into the rubric. Do you favor an organization because of the county they're in? And do you give more credence to members or organizations with board members that are similar to you in age and background? So these are just some of the questions that Impact actually has raised earlier in previous DEI trainings and reading materials. So we wanted to put them out here today for your understanding, for your reflection. And then, as I said, call on some experienced and mentors in the impact community for their perspective on DEI and how that impacts our day-to-day work with the RFFs. And to begin that discussion, I'm going to call on Ellen Bernstein, who has served in a DEI capacity in impact and has lent her expertise. So Ellen, just based on the slide that you saw on your experience within impact, would you like to comment further on impact and DEI?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to give my thoughts today. And what I thought I would do today is we use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion a lot. And for me, those words encompass a variety of goals, actions, and biases, and often there's confusion about what they mean. Interestingly, I came across 4 articles written in yesterday's Inquirer about DEI. And one of those articles was titled Diversity, Inclusion, and Philanthropy, the Comcast Way. And in that article, the chief DEI officer gave a definition, and I thought it might be good to share that definition and then apply it to the other articles that were in the paper and to some of the experiences I have had in the FAC process and what I've, as chair of the DEI committee, previous chair, what I have heard about our process. So first, diversity as defined by the DEI officer for Comcast is sort of a baseline case of representation. More people from various backgrounds need to be at the table. Equity is recognizing that everybody's not at the same starting place. And inclusion is what we all want an environment to feel like, where we don't have to guess why we're at the table. There was another article in the paper that reported on a mentorship program that was started to encourage Black men to become doctors. There was a third article reported that talked about changes in the admissions policy to Philadelphia School District's 39 criteria-based and citywide admission schools. And the fourth article was a column written about age discrimination directed against a woman in television in Canada with gray hair and a female politician in her 50s. Probably a lot of you know what I'm talking about there. But each of those articles talked about the application of DEI concepts and are applicable to our process. In particular, the Comcast article talked about making changes in the workplace and in leadership of the corporation to ensure that diverse voices are heard at all levels of the company. Likewise, the Impact Board is trying to do that, bringing diverse voices to the board, to leadership positions, and the proposals that we are reviewing, we may want to consider what those organizations are doing to bring more voices to the work of that organization. The mentorship article and the school district articles are about recognizing that not everyone starts at the same place, and programs may be to assist disadvantaged groups to get to the same starting point as privileged groups. In our grant review process, a proposal may attempt to bring equity to a disadvantaged group by raising them up to get to the same starting point as a more privileged group. And the age discrimination article reinforces what Anna Marie just said, certain conscious or unconscious biases that may exist in the entertainment and the political world. In our process, we all need to consider the conscious and unconscious biases that we bring to our discussions. Every single person has unconscious biases because we've all lived different experiences. What's really important is to recognize those biases so that our decisions aren't based upon them. In addition to racial, gender, or national origin bias that we all have talked about and probably are more aware of, consider biases that impact members may also have experienced. For example, disability. Are you as a reviewer uncomfortable around people with a disability? Geographic bias. Are you afraid to go on a site visit because the organization is in a high crime area? Beauty bias. Do you give more credence to someone that you find good looking or dresses well? And affinity bias, again, I think we all probably know what that is. Are you comfortable talking with someone who looks more like you? Finally, I do want to bring up one more term, which is called microaggressions. And this is a communication, it could be verbal or nonverbal, that conveys overt or latent hostility to someone in a marginalized group. The behavior can be unintentional or it can be very intentional. There have been examples of microaggressions that have been reported to me when I did chair the DEI committee. For example, there were impact members that felt like their opinions were not validated, or they were interrupted when speaking because of their age. Another anecdote I heard was from a woman of color who heard disparaging remarks about certain unsafe neighborhoods when in fact she lived in that community. These microaggressions may lead an FAC member to feel that they aren't included, that they don't believe that they belong at the table. So again, that inclusion part of DEI is really important so that everyone that participates in our processes feels comfortable expressing themselves and being part of our process. So finally, for me, is I try to take what I learn outside of impact, like reading the newspaper, reading these I couldn't believe there were 4 articles just yesterday directly on point in the Inquirer. Today, there's another article that talks about the budget that Mayor Kenny's proposing, where there are specific DEI funds that are going to be used to support anti-violence and education programs. Those are funds that a group of people in the government from all different, in the city government from all different departments have determined those 2 areas are the areas of equity where funds need to be spent by the city in order to bring the more disadvantaged communities of Philadelphia up to a different level, a different starting point. You may or may not agree, but at least by reading those articles, I continually think about the concepts of diversity. Different groups of the government were brought to that process. Equity, how do we spend our funds? And inclusion, those disadvantaged groups need to feel included in the process and making changes. So I really encourage you, as we move into this next phase of the grant process, to actively learn about DEI concepts. Impact can provide learning through education, but it's up to all of us to be aware of what's going on around us in our workplaces, in government, in our community, in our in our personal lives. And also please consider what unconscious biases you may have as you begin the second part of this FAC process.
Ellen, thanks so much for your reflections on that. I think that it was very timely. Your articles are very timely. There are a number of resources and articles that we'll be sending out after this that you can read some of these things for yourself. And as Ellen said, just continue kind of the self-reflection. This is something that is a very personal thought process that each one of us, has to go through. And I think it's critical to our grant making process. So with that, we're going to shift gears a little bit to trust-based philanthropy. Let's see. So what does that mean? We've been, kind of tossing around this term. We've changed a lot about our grant process this past year to focus more on trust-based philanthropy. But the definition we're all pretty familiar with, but now we want to take a little bit deeper dive and make sure we're all on the same page. So multi-year unrestricted funding with the trust really in the nonprofit. Where it belongs. So they know where they have the most impact within their operations. So moving that RFF responsibility to the funder, saving nonprofits time in the early stages of vetting, which we've simplified our application process, simplifying and streamlining, transparent and responsive communication has been always a priority. I don't know if you've seen the thousands of emails that Alice has responded to in the last few weeks or so, that she has at her core value responsive communication, and soliciting and acting on feedback, offering support after the check is mailed, of course, our nonprofit liaison, and just the work we do is so important, and embracing of this trust-based philanthropy philosophy. So with that, let's pause again, because I'm going to ask two impact members who have much experience in this area to comment a little bit further about how we arrived at this point of trust-based philanthropy at our center, at our core, and just comment just a little bit of perspective on where we go from here. So with that, Mary, would you like to start? Mary?
Actually, I'm going to pass it to Beth first.
Okay.
If that's okay, and then I'll follow.
Okay, that's fine. Beth, how about you? We start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Beth Dolly. As we kind of started to actively implement trust-based philanthropy, when the phrase first came about, we were really reminded that impact has actually had a long history of integrating trust-based philanthropy principles. Even before we knew that term, it was a commonly or widely applied philosophy. We're around 15 years now, and in just our second year, we made two pretty monumental shifts for us, because at the time we provided restricted programming to exclusive projects or programs, but in just the second year, we capped those grants at $100,000 and started giving out the excess funding to other finalists. So that second year, we gave out 3 grants, and 2 of them were unrestricted operating grants with no strings attached to other of the finalists. And at the same time, we allowed the impact grant, the organization that got $100,000, to dedicate up to 15% of that $100,000 as organizational overhead. We didn't ask for a line item. We didn't care, what they did with it, but we got such tremendous feedback and like an aha moment from the nonprofit community that, wow, impact members kind of really get this. And we didn't realize that was actually trust-based philanthropy, but even all those years ago, it was. And then we, continued to move in trust-based philanthropy tenets, again, even before we know that it was a commonly used phrase. And I'm going to guess on the year here, Mary, like 2016 or 2017, we migrated and shifted our project and program-based funding to completely unrestricted. We called it core mission funding, but it was unrestricted general operating support. And at the same time, we lengthened the grant term. We used to require our grantees to expend the funds within 15 months, and we expanded that term to 24 months. So in essence, it was almost like a 2-year grant. They got $100,000 and they could spread it across 24 months to expend the funds. One other thing that we have always done is that we've never had particularly onerous or rigorous reporting requirements for our grantees. And we don't require any kind of reporting for our smaller operating grants. And then the last thing we did, and I credit Mary with this, that when trust-based philanthropy became a kind of a philosophy, Mary really got us thinking about how we could help smaller community-based organizations where the folks on the ground really do know best what their community needs and how best to disseminate funds to support their mission. And we started a 2-year program that we called Community Awards, which totally upended the traditional application review process that not only Impact 100 follows, but pretty much everybody else that funds follows. And it was really designed to support community-based initiatives of small nonprofits here in the greater Philadelphia community. Again, there was no application, and the onus for identifying and vetting potential grantees was on impact members. So those are just some of the ways that, Impact 100 has kind of implemented practices that are more in line with the more commonly, expressed opinions of people behind the trust-based philanthropy movement. All right, Mary.
Yeah,
all you.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, and just to add, I know we want to save a lot of time for Q&A, so I don't want to take much more, but just for me, I think beyond the practices Anna Maria laid out, trust-based philanthropy is really all about power dynamics and transparency. And I think the old model, if we really step back and look at it clearly, was funders dictating solutions, and in many cases actually dictating the problems without knowing what they were, but just coming down from on high to tell the community what was best. And I think what we've come to realize is how wrong that was and how fraught that was. And in fact, there was this wall between funders and grantees that prevented the outcome that everybody wants, which is to serve the community. We were just, I think in the old days, philanthropists were just completely in the dark about what was the best way to do that. And I think now we have come to realize it. So the other problem that, as Beth mentioned, was the project funding that even we did in our early years. Funders would put very tight controls around their grants. And that also is undermining to the outcome that I think everybody is looking for. So trust-based philanthropy is, to me, a more realistic and informed approach to giving. We now look at ourselves and our grantees as partners. We recognize rightly that they are the experts. They're the ones on the ground, seeing the problems firsthand, maybe practicing, piloting solutions, and it's up to us to communicate and have an open door and help support that good work, and certainly bring our own perspective to it, but just recognize that we are a support to those who really know firsthand what the needs are. And I would say further for us, for Impact, for Impact 100, we are all about having an impact. And that's our goal all along. It's combining all of our donations into these larger grants that we all know have more impact than what we could do on our own. And we want those big grants to have the biggest effect they can. And I think, as Beth mentioned, going to unrestricted funding just elevated the impact of all those funds. As part of that work, we had a long-running planning committee that I think many of you were on. I see names on the call. And one of the most informative things we did was talk to past grantees and hear them talk about, yes, the funds were wonderful, but had they been unrestricted, they would have been even more powerful, and it would have allowed them to serve more people and pivot when needed, when something changed in their environment. So just the only two other quick things I would say is, beyond what Beth mentioned, I think that move to unrestricted grants was huge in our path, our walk down this road toward trust-based philanthropy. I think community awards as a pilot was huge also for, as Beth said, taking on the work ourselves, trying that out. It allowed us to expand our funding into areas of Philadelphia that we had not reached before, to smaller organizations, to organizations led by people who live and work in the community they serve. That was a huge focus for community awards. And then to give these smaller grants to small organizations. The other thing is, as I know it's been a big topic this year, this continuing evolution and assessment of our proposals. So prior to going to the request for funding, the RFF this year, we had made a first step in that direction by simplifying our application. There's a movement called Fix the Form that's been going around in philanthropy, a very powerful movement to, again, let's look at ourselves as funders and let's take a harder look and hold ourselves more accountable in this process. And so we'd already gone down that road, but I think the request for funding, as much as we'll evaluate it and make changes potentially after this year, it has been a move toward trying to make this an easier process for those hundreds of applicants who come in the door to us in any one year.
Well, what a journey Impact has been on, and how for those who have been part of this process for many years, you've seen such a change, and really this change is going so much in the right direction. I'm loving hearing this process and the steps on this journey, because I think we've done some great things, and there's more TBD, more to be determined as we continue to fine tune and move further into the area of trust-based philanthropy. So we're going to switch gears one more time, and then I'd really like all of you to think about what's on your mind, what questions do you have, and we'll talk more in a minute. And that is just, again, finally, site visits. And many of you have been on site visits before, perhaps not. If it's your first time, you'll be planning and talking about this within your FAC, but there's obviously some logistic things to do, confirming who the leader is, the note taker. A report is required at the end of your meeting, but during the visit, obviously be as professional as possible with introductions. Make sure that they know who you are, and the executive director, leave it to the executive director to introduce the staff. And just be mindful of time. All of this trust-based philosophy is wonderful, but when their time is so valuable. And so let's be sure to use it efficiently. And then with a thank you, next steps, we're asking, of course, as last year, finalists 2 to 3 minute video, and then the voting packet to be ready for all members for the June 5th annual meeting. So again, just a few reminders for the site visit. And with that, I'd like to stop sharing and either put questions in the chat if you're not at a point where you can speak, but we're happy to. Ellen, Beth, Mary, Alice, and I would love to answer questions or just anything that's on your mind with regard to these topics. The forum is open now. So what questions do you have?
I'm going to chime in just to give the floor to Kim for just a second for the Spring Ed program, which ties into what we've been doing.
Thank you, Alice. Yes, I just thank you. That's very generous. I'll just take a second here to highlight that you all have gotten an invitation to our Spring Ed, which will be on the evening of March 21st. It's on Zoom from 7 to 8 p.m. and it's highlighting particularly a report that was done by the Urban Affairs Coalition and the United Way came out last summer. Recommendations from Black-led nonprofits or Black nonprofit leaders in our region for funders in our region. The Urban Affairs Coalition Executive Director Charmaine Matlock-Turner is a new member this year, so we're hearing from a member to address some of these points that you all just highlighted, some of the things that Beth and Mary just talked about, and what else it could mean for us going forward. So just a quick plug for that if you haven't already registered.
That's timely. Thank you so much, Kim. So I see Mary has put in the chat the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. As I said, Beth has some suggestions on some articles, as well as Ellen. And some of these resources will be included in the materials after that we will follow up with you. So what's on your mind now? What would you like either more information about, observations or questions about trust-based philanthropy or DEI?
I had one question I realized I struggled a little bit with in the review, which was when rating the group on DEI, I realized near the end I was being a little bit inconsistent. With some I would compare or judge it on based on the community they served, how representative was it of the community they served, and then some others I think I was more comparing it to what the average probably would be of what I saw in other groups and their boards or their leadership. And so I was comparing more to what is their standing against other organizations rather than how are they comparing. Anyways, there's sort of a model for that, how to do that consistently.
Do you mean you were at some point comparing their board to the populations they serve and then the board to other organizations?
So for instance, yes, if I saw a group where, I mean, it was obvious if the representation really was not very good, but that wasn't a lot of organizations. And this might've been something that I think I reflected on after I'd done it, that evolved over the course of looking at all the numbers. And so initially I was just looking, I think, on, okay, this is the population they serve, and does this seem representative? And then I think by the end, the ones at the end, I might have gotten a bit of a gift in my ranking, because I realized, oh, they're doing a lot better than some of the other groups I've seen. And so maybe then I would rank that a little bit higher, even though it wasn't exactly representative of the group they served.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And those kinds of, fluctuations during your own personal evaluation are bound to happen. And I don't know if our speakers have any advice, but it's, consistency is the key to maybe go back over some of the previous organizations that you've reviewed, just to look for that consistency. Mary, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll just, hey, Maggie, it's great to
Oh,
see
hi,
you.
Mary.
I think you just put your finger on it, that it is so hard to be truly consistent. And it's great that you're trying to be, but this is all fundamentally, I think, a gray area, this kind of evaluation, where we have limited information. We're trying to do our best to kind of assess where the impact would be highest. I personally, especially coming out of community awards, feel that the representation of the communities being served is the most important. We've often used the example of an organization working in the disability community. It's probably for them more important to have representation of people with disabilities as opposed to racial representation that represents the city of Philadelphia. So it is extremely nuanced. If it's an LGBTQ organization, there are all these things where I think the point is to have leadership and decision makers who understand the needs of the populations being served, as opposed to like the old model I was talking about. You would so often have an all-white board of a nonprofit serving maybe an all-Black community, and it's just, that's not what you're after. You're not going to have the best impact that way.
Yeah, Ellen, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I would just like to question that just like impact is in a process of changing what our board and leadership might look like, the many organizations are also in that process, and doing DEI work is a process. So you not only can you look at the board, but as you're reviewing the applications, look at their volunteer base. It could be that in their volunteer base, that's where there's a greater number of people representing the communities that, Mary just talked about. And we, even in impact, we talk about the pipeline to the board, to leadership is through committees. So try not to be so rigid in looking at the numbers as opposed to the process that is being used to bring people to the table and bring people into leadership positions so that they are the ones that are making the decisions for the communities that they're serving.
Yeah, Madge, did you have something to add to that, or is it a different question?
No, it was to add really that along the lines of what Ellen said. I mean, there was that whole section in the RFF about, efforts being made. So yeah, I gave points if the, almost as many, points if they had a good plan, if they were, hiring a diversity person or a consultant and they were making efforts in that direction, there was a wide range of the way organizations were able to answer that question. Some really clearly had been thinking about this and had a plan in place, and others it was just kind of a rote answer. So I actually scored organizations that may not have been as diverse at the leadership effort at this moment in time if it looked like they were really taking it seriously about moving forward.
Yeah, that's also a good point. Yeah, what formal things are in place to address it? Alice, is this reflection on that? Yeah.
Yes. And it's good to follow on to Madge's point, which is, are they making efforts? I think this is really clear in site visits. So which are, coming up, it's a good question to ask at the site visit, and just physically being on site, seeing who's presenting, seeing how they present is a really good indicator of that. And if they're aware of, if they tell you about the plan, if it's clear that it's an all-white group presenting and all of their constituents are not, or abled and disabled, whatever the variant is a consciousness of it becomes evident in the site visits, and it's something to keep in mind then.
And Sue, is this?
It's a follow-up to the same issue, and I guess mine's a comment. I'd like to see us in the future develop a more nuanced approach to this issue, because a lot of the comments that I'm hearing in some ways show our prejudices that organizations even have the ability to have a plan, because a lot of these smaller organizations that we're looking to fund have just gotten off of a pandemic where they were really struggling and trying to deal with they had their irons in the fire on a lot of different issues. So you may have an organization that is 2 or 3 years old. Perhaps it was started by white men. I'm just giving an example. And they may not yet have a plan, but they're doing unbelievable work in the community. So they may have like the beginnings of a plan, And then you may have an organization that's been around for 15 years that was started by white men, and they still haven't progressed to having any community representation. Those two we would look at very differently, I think. You know, the one that's been around for 15 years and has still not made any efforts and is well funded, that's a very different case. So I'd like to see us talk about a more nuanced approach and answer the question, which I don't think has been answered this year, is how is the organization's movement towards diversity and inclusion weighted versus the work that they're actually doing in the community? And I think the discussions have been a little bit confused. I think people like, if they're not diverse, does that mean we don't fund them? If they're doing extraordinary work in the community, or is the work that they're doing in the community the most important part? And, you know, a little bit. So I think we as an organization, and also as an organization of predominantly white women, have to develop a more nuanced conversation and let our members know how to weight these different. We have education to do, and how is this weighted? Because the conversations we've been having in our group are interesting, but people are weighting different things differently. And some people are saying if they're not diverse, then we can't fund them. And I don't know that that's where we are on this issue. I just don't know. So I think there's a little bit of confusion that would be helpful to illuminate our members about.
Yes, yeah, so certainly food for thought, and always education is always something that we strive and is important. So there are plenty of areas for further study. So there's a question in the chat, and Marcia, unfortunately, I'm not really understanding your question. We talk about trust-based philanthropy. We still hear that it's way over under our budget. I'm not sure what you mean.
So what I'm thinking about is how we have a full range of applications and they all have varying budgets, but there have been some comments when evaluating the RFFs that still come out just as a sole comment that an organization's budget is way more than what we have identified as our preferred budget. And even though we're educating our members, it nevertheless pops up as one of the criteria almost that people might tend, as they go about evaluating or rating or ranking, a little bit heavier than some of the others. And so I guess I'm throwing it out to see if any of you have also experienced this and how you deal with it, because it hasn't necessarily come up in a face-to-face conversation, but it certainly has come up in some of the member comments about why they evaluated certain organizations, because they did not hit our sweet spot, shall I say.
Okay, Betsy, do you have a reflection on that? Yeah. You're on mute though.
I had actually heard similar comments as well and seen them in print, Marcia, and for years we have. At the same time, and in a parallel theme, I still hear members talk about organizations. Oh, we funded them in the past. You know, and as soon as somebody says that, it feels like, especially for newer members, they often they don't need our funding. And I'm not saying anything new to Alice or Anna Maria that I haven't said through all of last year's strategy programs. You know, one of the things I think we need to think about and revisit is the requirement that organizations who receive $100,000 from us wait at least 3 full cycles to apply again. So if that's our rule and we're going to let them do it, we have to stop dinging them, even cavalierly in our meetings, if they do reapply. And if we are never going to fund somebody up to $100,000 twice, then we should just say you can never apply again, because it's a waste of their time and it's a waste of our time. And I think it makes us look bad. And I find a very it kind of parallel experience with what you've experienced with the preferred range of our operating budgets.
Yeah, something definitely to talk about. We would want our practice and our policy to align. That's for sure.
Well, it's especially true, I think, because we often say as a good point for people applying for and receiving our grants, that it opens up the rest of the world's eyes to the work that this organization is doing. And that's reflected when those organizations become recognized and get funding from other sources. So I think it's kind of funny that we would be penalizing a grant that an organization that previously received a grant, going out, getting some more money, and then being saying, oh no, they got our grant already, so we shouldn't give them another term. So I'm just commenting that as a way that we are not always fair in how we look at our request for funding.
Mhm. Yeah, Mary?
Yeah, just I'm kind of a broken record with this. I think it's all, as Sue said, very nuanced, and it's all a gray area. So Marcia, to your point, I do hear that. I think back to a year when we had the Philadelphia Zoo apply. And we all said, you know, yes, their budget is way above our range, and also our funding goals are to raise the profile of lesser known organizations. And so I think oftentimes the budget is kind of just aligned with how well known an organization is. So I think sometimes people do flag that because maybe they don't articulate it that way, but it ties into the fact that this organization doesn't feel like as good of a fit for us. And to the reapplying question, I just think it is very nuanced. I totally agree, Beth. There's no way we should ding an organization. On my FAC this year, a couple of you are on it. We had an organization that has previously received funding. And when we were weighing it, I don't think everybody agreed on this, but when we were weighing it side by side with other small new organizations, we were trying to say, would our grant raise the profile of this repeat funded group? Not that that's not something they should be, qualified for, but it's just part of the calculation. And none of this is easy, but it takes kind of holding it all in your head together at the same time, I think, and giving that balance. And as we all know, we wish we could give out far more grants because it is really hard to come down to one finalist in each of these FACs.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, Ellen, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I would just like to say that I totally agree with what Sue Dubois said. And I think that next year, especially because we tried out that rubric, we need to give guidance in that rubric about weighting what of the criteria are important. But in the DEI area, there were, if I remember correctly, there were 2 or 3 questions around DEI, and I just agree with Sue. We need to give guidance as to why we're asking that question and the weight of the questions. And just because an organization might have an all-white board still, in my opinion, they shouldn't be penalized by that. So for next year's grant review committee, I think that's a very important consideration to be given. I think now it's a little too late, but that's all I want to say.
I'm sure we will continue to fine tune these things, and the rubric has proven to be very easy to use. People have been leaving great comments, which has shaped conversations and rankings. And Alice, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think how you weight the DEI is the same as some of these other funding questions, and it's something that traditionally, that may be not the right word, but as an organization, we haven't wanted to define for our members. We want our members to weigh in on what's important to them and what's impactful for them. And and I'm sorry, I can't remember who made the comment, whether somebody says they are conscious of their lack of diversity and they're working towards a plan, and that made them decide one thing or another. I think that's everybody's individual sort of option to weigh, just as weighing what impact is an individual choice. So I'm not sure when you say to give guidance that we would ever give sort of a really detailed guidance on weigh this more than that. That's sort of just not really how we operate.
I know, but by asking multiple questions, there's an assumption, I think, an unconscious assumption that those issues may rise to a more important level. So I'm not suggesting that we say this is how you should rate it, but it can be part of a discussion. And the FAC leaders can, again, talk about that nuance or talk about how a member might consider efforts to diversify the board or their volunteer base. I think that I found even I, who am so interested in these areas and think it's so important, there were 2 or 3 questions that took up, it felt like that was sort of the important thing. So I don't know if that makes sense or not. I just think that it can be part of a discussion of how to evaluate the proposals.
Yes, Sue?
I wanted to follow up on Anna Maria and the rubric. And I'm sure, knowing impact, we're going to do a survey and find out everybody's reactions. But talking to some other impact members, I think a rubric can be very helpful, and I think it's a good step. But I will say, when I was going through the applications, I found that I could have an organization that had all 5s on the rubric, and I still didn't want to pass them through. And so I really struggled with that. And that's not, in my mind, that's not a helpful rubric, because for people that have been involved with this for a long time, and then I started sort of finagling with my answers to the rubric so that I could get them where they were supposed to be, which didn't make sense. So just something to consider. I know there's going to be more study, and I think a rubric can be very helpful, particularly for people who are doing this the first time. But I think there's probably another way we can do it that will be more helpful. I just found a disconnect there. So I just wanted to share that. And I know there were other people that I talked to that had similar issues, and we were calling each other like, what do I do with the rubric? Because I have a 5, but I don't want to pass them through. So just to share that.
Yeah, no, certainly at the end, yes, no became one of the most important questions. So there's a lot that gets you to that point one way or the other, and we'll continue to discuss and fine tune some of these tools. So thank you for that. So other questions on your mind about, as you think ahead about your site visit, about your discussions with the organizations that your FAC is reviewing, questions on either DEI or trust-based philanthropy, or site visits?
I have a question on site visits. How many people do you typically have on an individual site visit?
That go to the site visit? Yeah, I'm going to say 3 to 5, but you should talk it over with them. Some of the organizations' spaces are limited, so.
Yeah, we often have more than that. I mean, we've had groups of 10 or 12 people, and I would expect this year, because it's open to the full FAC, we may have somewhat larger groups, but as Anna Maria said, it depends on the locations and their site limitations.
Right, they might want to limit it, have the discussion beforehand, but yeah, it's how many years has it been? There were 2 years they were remote or virtual, or 1 year?
Yes, 2 years it was virtual.
So now everything's in person. So yeah, there's a lot of probably enthusiasm, but let's be mindful of, and of course, the note taking and reporting back is all that much more critical.
Most of the organizations are happy to have as many people as possible because it gives them good exposure. So while it depends on their programs, and to some degrees on the FAC, it varies somewhat, but please participate in the site visits.
Just one little comment on that. I think that when people are contacting the site visit organization, that's a question to ask. How many people can you handle? And then use that in setting up the visit.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. And that would be that the FAC chairs or leaders are making those calls. So Joan will ask that question, but a good reminder to others on the call.
All right, well, your questions have been good. Joan, did you have anything else or no?
Well, if nobody else had a question, I would just bring up something that was on my mind, and something that Ellen talked about made me think, because I read at least one of those articles yesterday, in particular, the one on the schools. And you didn't bring up the fact that the full headline of that article was "Be cognizant of unintended consequences." And I think that's something that we have to think about also, because, just saying DEI and saying we believe in DEI and putting in place things like rubrics, we have to be careful that, again, what other people have said, that we don't overweight it and not look at whether the organization is really serving the community, or really whether the board reflects the community, as opposed to having, X number or percent of representation on their boards.
Yeah, I think one theme throughout the time here today is just really the balance that we're all faced with in evaluating the different proposals and reading everything through carefully and taking into account our values and where we're going with trust-based philanthropy and DEI, and all that is a really tremendous burden, for a challenge for everyone, an impact. And I know that you all on the call here today, everyone takes it very seriously. And we thank you for that. Thank you for the time that you've invested in this. So we're almost at time.
So I would just remind everybody that we will be sending a recording out of this to all of you and to anybody who registered for this event, or who was invited to the event. And it will include some of the links to some pertinent materials about DEI and trust-based philanthropy for your future reference.
So best of luck with the discussions ongoing. Please have your say. Consider all the material that we covered today with DEI and trust-based philanthropy. And for anyone who was not at the meeting today within your FAC, make sure that they review the materials and are prepared for the next phase. So with that, thank you all so much for participating today. We'll sign off, but you have our contact information. If there's ever a time that you would like to reach out with a specific question, please don't hesitate to do so. All right, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.